Okay, today's lecture is on mouthparts and feeding strategies of medically relevant insects. So one of the common things you'll see is that there is a sort of basic insect mouth plan that we're going to go over, which kind of looks like this. And in each of the different insects that bite you, they all have different adaptations and evolutions to those mouth parts that make them good at biting you. And we talked in the last lecture a little bit about how you do see some kind of like convergent evolution in a sense that the same shapes start to evolve independently for insects that suck blood or feed on blood, hematophagy, through various mechanisms. And understanding the mouth parts is important for medical entomology because understanding the different mouth parts of and in terms of how they acquire their blood meal dictates how they actually physically transmit pathogens. So looking at and understanding the mouth parts, how they work, has a lot of, or it provides a lot of insights into actually how diseases are spread. So quickly, in general, so I'll just do some quick terms here. Anterior, right, we should kind of, this is basic easy term, you should kind of know this, that's like the face near the front, and then obviously opposite of posterior. And the insect head is kind of unique in a sense that, so if you, let's see if I can draw here. If you think of like a millipede, right, that has like a bunch of segments and a bunch of legs, this is kind of like the developmental program for how insects develop. Is insects are split into segments, okay, and each of these segments has kind of like a limb. Now, I'm kind of like stretching the definition of limb. Like in some segments, obviously this limb is going to be like a leg. And in some segments, this limb is going to be like a wing. And in some segments, the limb might be an antennae. And in some segments, the limb might be what we sort of call, I kind of call as a funny term, face legs, which are kind of like the insect mouth parts. And so if you understand this, and I know Lauren has taken my biotechnology class where I gave a lecture on developmental biology of insects, you know that this is kind of like the program. The program for how insects develop is split the organism. If here's the egg, it starts to split it into segments, okay? And then there's genes called Hox genes, that dictate on these particular segments what kind of a limb should develop. Should it be like a leg, or should it be like an antennae, or should it be like an eye, or should it be like a mouth part, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of like the background knowledge. And when you look at the insect face, so I have this term here, which is called gnathocephalon. And this is discussed in the assigned reading, which is actually assigned a Snodgrass reading. So Snodgrass was a famous insect morphologist. I really like his illustrations. This is one of his illustrations describing the gnathocephalon. And that was, again, that was in the reading. And the point of the gnathocephalon is like the insect head is unique in that what it is it's multiple segments. Here he's drawn 1, 2, 3, 4 that have fused. So you can imagine if the developmental program is to just like segment things and make legs to make the head, the insect has essentially evolved to learn how to just like fuse these together into like a head. And these sort of limbs have evolved to become mouth parts. So I just think that's kind of like a really fascinating thing about insect evolution and insect development, that the head is actually this fusion of segments. And here I have a term somites, which is, I think, an actual precise term for those segments, either that or the plates on each segment. You'd have to fact check me, but you get the point. The other relevant point to this slide is, do you guys know why the mouth parts are anterior? So if this is my insect and it's anterior, right? And then like the butt is always like posterior. Why are the mouth parts, why are they always like right here, anterior? Why aren't their mouth parts like here or like here or in the butt? Why? What? Well, okay, mechanistically, sure, but like, what's the reason? What's the reason the mouth parts are in the head? Right, but the food hole could be anywhere. Food hole, in theory, could be like on the abdomen. Like, why is it in the head? It might sound like a dumb question, but it's actually like, I feel like it's a fun thing worth bringing up. So the reason the mouth parts are in the head is because the head is always facing the direction in which the insect is moving. And so if you think about just sort of the biological program of all organisms, like when you're moving towards food, even like an amoeba is moving like towards food. And so the mouth parts evolve naturally in the direction of like in which the organism is moving, because it's moving towards food. So it's just kind of an interesting reason, like that's why our heads are where we eat, as opposed to like eating out of other regions. Okay, we got that. Okay, so here's a head of a grasshopper. And this is another like famous illustration from Snodgrass. And a grasshopper is very, very commonly used to just sort of outlay the general face program of all insects. Okay, so if here's the gnathocephalon, what you want to remember is the names of these different mouth pieces. Okay, so the first mouth pieces are mandibles. Okay, so again, these are like the face legs, and the mandibles usually kind of look something like this. And the mandibles are essentially like a claw with a hinge. Okay, so there's essentially just a hinge, and the only directional movement they have is like this. Okay, so those are the mandibles, and if you look at them in here, they are right here, MD. It's highlighted MD. These are the mandibles. You see this all the time. Okay, and then the next ones that come are MX. These are called the maxillary, I'm gonna spell it wrong, whatever, I don't care about spelling, maxillary palps. Okay, and these ones are actually like legs. Okay, and the way that insect legs are organized is at each of these segments, the rotation at which this segment can rotate is I shouldn't say rotate, but hinge upon is alternated. So you can imagine if there's a Z let's see, so this would be the Z axis and this would be the X axis. Okay, you can imagine this first segment, it only hinges on an X axis, and then this next segment usually hinges on a Z axis, and then this next segment hinges on an X axis. So they build sort of much maneuverability of being able to move joints by alternating singular hinges on either an X or a Z axis. That's true for the legs, and that should be true also in the mouth parts, I think. And then there's this third pair, the labial palps. So these are labial palps, okay? And again, it's just another set of face legs, if you look at them. Now, these are all differently evolved in the insects that bite you into specialized structures that bite you, okay? So you'll see these pieces come up, the mandibles, maxillary palps, labial palps, but it's kind of like evolution of, like, if you look at you look at like the fin of like a whale, you know, you can like see like the finger digits. It's not really like fingers, but like you can see like the bones inside that correspond to like the homology of bones. It's kind of the same thing with insect face mouth parts, is when you look at these vastly different structures, you can still find like structures that correspond to what the mandibles were, structures that correspond to what the maxillary palps were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then there's two like lips, which you kind of need to remember. And this is actually like really confusing. I always need to like review this. There's a labrum and a labium. Okay. And again, like I'm looking at my notes here because I always confuse labial palps, labrum, and labium. Okay. So the labrum is the what's called the upper lip. The upper lip, and that's what kind of like sits atop the mandibles. So the LM right here, the labrum, that's like the upper lip. Okay. And the labium is like the lower lip, and from the labium proceed the labial palps. So it's actually not, I don't think it's marked in here, but the labium would be like a structure kind of like right here from which the labial palps come out. They're marking it as this thing right here, LB. Okay. So that's like the basic gist of the insect mouth parts. Let's see if there's anything I missed. Here I have some slides where they're like color coordinated. You can see they kind of like split it apart. If you just Google like insect mouth parts, these are famous illustrations. You'll find a whole bunch. But you get the basic like pattern. Okay. Now, some of the insects that we care about, or non-insects rather, that we care about are spiders, right? Or arachnids, or ticks, which are chelicerates, or mites, which are chelicerates. So the chelicerates, the mouth parts are different, and that's where actually the chelicerate, the Chelicerate, whatever that taxonomic clade is, that's where that comes from. It's the mouth parts are different organization, and they're named different. So in spiders, there's a cheliceral base, okay, which has like fangs, and they also have palps, but by and large, the mouth part organization is different, and the focal point is these like big giant chelicerates, okay, and these are kind of like mandibles. So you hear it says they're used to grasp food. They're kind of like mandibles, but they're different. But same concepts, same difference. Also, there's a fused structural fusion of the facial somites, which creates the evolutionary scenarios where these things can evolve. Okay. So this slide is basically like, there's a lot of, whoop, don't want to do that. There's many different ways aside from mouth parts in which the things that bite you, the creatures that bite you, evolve specifically to become better at biting you. So here's an example of mosquito mouth parts, which we're going to talk about in detail. So again, you can see that these structures are color coded in a way where you can see where they actually derive from, but it's a vastly different organization, in a sense that like they form completely different structures, but they derive from those original basic structures. And not only mouth parts evolve, but like here's a claw from a louse, okay? And I show this because the evolution of ectoparasites and things that bite you is so specific that in cases of the louse, their claws, these claws that I'm showing you, the actual like diameter of the grip, so like this area right here, the actual diameter of the grip of that claw is specifically evolved to wrap around, in our case, like human hair, okay? So a good question is, if you take a louse that's evolved to hold on by holding onto human hair, and you put that louse on a different creature, can it survive and hold on to that other creature? You're falling asleep. I'm telling you that the louse is so evolved to specifically be on human bodies that even its claws are a very specific diameter such that they perfectly wrap around the diameter of human hair. Now the question is, if I take the louse off of a human head and put it on a different organism, can it survive? No, because their claws are not like evolved to hold on, right? And this is just an example. Like there are many of these evolutions that make these ectoparasites and these things that feed on you so specialized that it's very, very common or I should say specialization is common. It's very common that these things cannot just like cross feed on different things. Or you can't, for instance, it maybe would be unlikely that you would be infected with like a bird louse because they're not evolved to be on your body. And the evolution of these, like if you actually like look at, I'm running out of room here. If you actually look at like the evolutionary like trees of ectoparasites, okay, so these are like lice, things that are parasites like on your body. Those evolutionary trees actually like match the evolutionary trees of in theory, like imagine mammals, the mammals that they're on. So like if we have like human, and here's like gorilla, and here's like chimp, the lice evolution is essentially looks exactly the same. Human louse, gorilla louse, okay, and chimp louse, etc. So what this is saying is like it's so specialized that the mammal is actually like a little island that these lice live on, and they can't get off. Once they're on there, like that's the means through which they maintain their survival, and it's literally like an island, like they can't get off. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, now this is sort of like a general example. Don't take me to task on like specifically like gorilla louse, chimp louse, human louse evolution until we get to the louse lecture. Now there's other examples of evolutions that help insects adapt to feeding on you. So we talked about structures that cling to the host, claws, talked about mouth parts that are specialized to feed on you, but also to like saliva. So in each of these insects, they all have salivary glands, just like you make spit and I make spit. They have specialized proteins, which they make, which help them feed on particular hosts. And those proteins are evolved to cause certain phenotypes on the hosts that they're feeding on to help them feed. So again, just 3 examples of many different evolutions that help these creatures survive and uptake food from their hosts. Okay. Now, there's different names for which entomologists classify different feeding strategies. Okay, so in general, all these, we've already defined this hematophagy, they're all in general blood feeding, but there's different ways to acquire blood. And the mouth parts look different depending on these different strategies. Okay, so there's a term called telmophages. Telmophages are like deer flies, tabanids, right? Yes, yeah. Tabanids are like deer flies. Deer flies are telmophages, and they have what are essentially, the colloquial term is these are like razor blades. Razor blades. And what they do is they lacerate the skin, so they'll slash you with like knives. They'll lacerate your skin, and then you'll start bleeding, and then they suck up the blood. So they lacerate the skin and feed on pooling blood. That's one strategy. It's called telmophiles. Examples of creatures that do this are black flies, biting midges, horse flies, deer flies, etc. Okay. And here's what their mouth parts look like. You can see that they're kind of like blunted, and they actually look like little swords. That's literally like actually what they are. They're like little swords. Okay, and then there are like the mosquito, selenophages. So selenophages have essentially evolved like a long flexible needle, and it actually pierces the skin and it inserts into a capillary. So they're able to find capillaries. They insert their mouthparts into the capillary, and then they suck blood up. So this is obviously different from the telmophages, and their mouthparts reflect that. So the mosquito mouthparts are obviously worth discussing in detail. This was a thesis question I got, draw the mosquito mouthparts. This is a very, very common, important thing that I guess in theory, like entomologists should know. Kind of like the structure of a selenophage. How are their mouthparts organized? So let me just go through a couple things. This is a figure that I made. Looks pretty nice, huh? I made this in Illustrator, yes. So this is called the fascicle. So this entire sort of like mouthpart structure is called the mosquito fascicle. And it's got these different parts to it. And in a couple points about this, it's very flexible. So if you were to look, there are actually movies of this. If you just Google this, there are movies of mosquitoes, and they stick their proboscis in, and they can bend it. Like it's got muscles in it. They can control it. They can feel with it, and it has sensory neurons. It has sensory neurons that tell them like, oh, are you near a capillary? Are you not near a capillary? Oh, this tastes good. No, this don't taste good, etc. They can like literally like move their proboscis around. So it's not like these are like stiff, sharp swords like the telmophages. No, these are like very fine, maneuverable, and flexible stylets, which can pierce and suck blood. So let's talk about the individual pieces and how they contribute. Okay, so the LM, this is the, let me get this right. I always get them confused. Not the labium, the labrum. So I should just write this here. Labrum. The labrum looks like this, and it is a hollow needle. Okay, so in the mosquito labrum, which remember was that the upper lip. It was the upper lip in that grasshopper. Let's just go back and look at that quick. So that was this thing. In the mosquito, this thing has evolved into a sharp tube that looks like a needle, which is this right here. Okay, and blood sucks up through the labrum. Okay, and this is after the fascicle has pierced you, but before the fascicle has pierced you, essentially, I have a picture of this. What happens is the mosquito comes on top of you and it lands, and it does some probing. So the mosquito will like land on you, and it's trying to like find a good spot to feed, and it will kind of like poke you and poke around until it finds like a good spot. And once it finds a good spot, there is this sheath called the labium. So this was the lower lip in the grasshopper. Let's see if we can find that again. This thing underneath here. In the mosquito, the labium has evolved to become this protective sheath. So in here, it's very gray. I've made it right here in the back. In this one, you're actually seeing it right here, this furry, hairy thing. And in this picture, it's like right here, the labium. And the labium is this kind of like fatty, I don't know if it's soft, but it's like a fatty kind of protective sheath. It's like the sword sheath. And it protects the stylets. And so when the mosquito actually feeds, the labium retracts. So you can see how there's a bend here. It retracts back. It's never, the mosquito is never actually poking you with the labium. It's retracting the labium to reveal the stylets right here. Okay. And then what it's sticking into you is the labrum, which sucks up the blood. But before it sticks in the labrum, there are these stylets, the mandibles, and the maxillary stylets. And in mosquitoes, these sort of face legs have evolved to become sharp little thin blades. And the maxillary stylets are actually serrated. Okay, so you can see here, I've made them like jagged and sharp. You have a question? Okay. Serrated and sharp. And the mosquito actually saws your skin. So it doesn't just like stab you. It saws with the serrated maxillary stylets. And there's actually like a frequency of a certain amount of hertz at which these things oscillate, and they saw you. And then through that process, that decreases the amount of force that's required to puncture your skin with the labrum. So the function of the maxillary palps is to decrease the force required for the labrum to go in. And actually in mosquitoes where they have removed the maxillary palps and they don't have the sawing function, they can't bite you. They can't pierce. So they are essential for mosquito feeding. Okay. Now there's another tube called the hypopharynx, HP. And I want you to look at this cross section. This is a cross section of the mosquito mouth parts. This is the labium that retracts the protective sheath. Here, this thing, this blue thing is the labrum. So this is the tube from which the blood sucks up. Now, if you look right here, there's a little tube right here, okay? That is the HP, the hypopharynx. That is where the mosquito spits, through this little tiny tube. So through the hypopharynx is the tube through which the mosquito spits into your blood. So the important thing that you want to know, based on what I just told you, is there are two tubes, okay? And this is why in the first lecture I said the dirty needle analogy is not a good analogy for mosquitoes, because a dirty needle is what's called mechanical transmission. Mechanical transmission of diseases. So if you're thinking like, oh, you did some, what's the opium? You did some opium or something, and you get HIV/AIDS or something because you use a dirty needle. That's mechanical transmission. What's happening is this needle was used before, and there's some nasty things on that needle, and then when you poke it into yourself, you're actually like touching, and the pathogen is delivered by touch. Okay, mosquitoes are not like that. Mosquitoes are not mechanically transmitting vectors. Mosquitoes have the two tubes, and you can imagine when the mosquito feeds through the labrum, the only thing that's coming through this, it's one directional flow through up the labrum. It's going up, okay? So how you get infected is by the mosquito spitting through the other tube, the hypopharynx. This is why we discussed in the previous lecture that the mosquito has to bite first somebody that's infected, and their infection comes up through, okay, and it gets into their gut. And if the mosquito were to immediately go and bite somebody else, there's no mechanical transmission because the directional flow of that pathogen is one way, goes straight into the gut. So that mosquito, if it immediately bites somebody, will not spread that disease. But if the disease makes its way right out of the gut and gets into the salivary glands, then when the mosquito bites, it spits the pathogen out the hypopharynx, okay? So there's two tubes, and that relates to transmission of the disease. Okay, does that make sense? Mosquito mouthparts are just really cool. It's worth learning them because it's a really cool evolutionary example of specialization for like a specific purpose. Did that. Okay. Here's some tick mouthparts. Let's look at how these are different. So in the tick, this is called the hypostome, and it looks like this. And this structure is, so if you think of ticks, what do you remember about like getting ticks on you, about like pulling them off? What comes to your mind? Yes, they're hard to rip out. Look at this and tell me why that is. It's like a fish hook. So it literally, they stab their hypostome in, And when you try to pull this out, there are these serrated claws that prevent it from being pulled out. So the famous example is you don't pull ticks out by the body because the head is literally like stuck in there, and you'll just rip the body off and the head will still be there, and the head will still actually be feeding and still transmitting diseases to you. So you have to pull the tick off by putting your tweezers underneath the head, like here, and actually like ripping the hypostome out. And usually what happens is you rip out, like if you've done this from a dog, you'll rip out like a gigantic piece of skin because the tick's mouth part is actually like stuck in there. Okay. And that's not the only thing. So we talked about how these things are so specialized at evolution that like the tick's whole way of feeding is to just like stab itself in and get stuck there and suck blood. So it also has salivary gland proteins, special proteins that are called cementing proteins. So when the tick, this is gonna be like a bad tick. There's 4 legs or 8 legs. 8 legs. Here's the tick. When it sticks in you, it will spit special proteins that are actually like cement, and it will literally like glue its face to your body. So not only is the mouth parts like this, but it's also literally glued its face to your skin from the cementing proteins. And this is one example of how salivary gland proteins are specially evolved to assist feeding of these insects. Now they're also anticoagulants, which are, what are those? Who said physiology? Yeah, it prevents your blood from clotting. So both mosquitoes and ticks have these. So not only is it spitting out cementing proteins, but it's spitting out anticoagulants such that your blood, I can get a red marker, such that your blood keeps like coming to this area and keeps flowing so that it can keep sucking up your blood. There's so many evolutions here to make this work. What? We'll get to that point. The ticks eventually fall off when they get full, but it takes them a long time to get full. Okay. Here are chiggers, which are mites. These are mite mouthparts. What do you think that the chigger feeds on based on these mouthparts? What would you guess? Okay, is it going to be a selenophage? Is it going to stick its face into your capillary and suck your blood? I see Lauren shaking her head no. No. This is the mouth part right here. This is the mouth. It looks like it's about to kiss you. Like it's, you can't see the lips? I can see it now. This is its mouth right here. Here's its lips.
It looks like it digs into you.
Maybe. It's a decent hypothesis. Is it a telmophage?
Wait, no. I think it lacerates the skin and then it sucks from the surface.
No, that would be a telmophage. It obviously is not a telmophage because it doesn't have sharp swords for mouth parts. Does that make sense?
Oh, isn't it bone?
So these are like chewing mouth parts. So essentially the way that the chiggers feed is they sit on you and they spit, and the spit has proteases that dissolve your skin cells, and then they literally just like suck up your skin and they chew your skin. So what you're seeing here are mouth parts designed to suck up and like suck up and like chew skin. Chiggers actually chew skin. So chiggers will spread diseases, but I show this example because here's an example of a not necessarily hematophagous insect. They're eating your skin cells. But the chiggers can nevertheless spread diseases. And the way that happens is they get on your body and they might have some diseases inside them, and they start eating your skin and they create this bite, which is called the stylostome. But the stylostome does not go all the way in to the point where it's accessing blood. So how they spread diseases is what happens is this starts to itch, and then somebody smacks their arm and rubs it into their skin and rubs it and maybe scratches it so much that they make themselves bleed. And that's how you get diseases from chiggers. So this would essentially be kind of like a mechanical a mechanical transmission. Mechanical.
Like the jig is not the one that makes a hole in it. The one that where people that have chickens like this, like the hole inside of it.
Makes a hole. I mean, I'm thinking like bot flies. Like bot flies will like lay their eggs inside of you and make a hole. I don't know about like a hole though. Like maybe a selenophage would like pierce you and there'd be a teeny tiny hole. I don't know what you mean though by like making a hole.
Those things I saw a video on YouTube about chicken bites, and like there was like this.
Well, this you're saying the chigger bites make a hole?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what this thing is. It's like a stylostome, but it's probably microscopic. It's not like a gigantic hole that would be like. Oh, okay, I don't know if that would be chigger bites then. That was probably like somebody got some nasty infection and it like started like eroding their arm. I don't think that's naturally what you get from a chigger bite. Most of these are like microscopic wounds. How much time do I have left? Okay, 14 minutes. Okay, you don't need to know that I kind of got over excessive. Just so you know, this was the first class I ever taught. Lauren, this might make you feel more comfortable. I went psycho about like the key terms, and there's like so many key terms. You only need to know the ones that I talk about in the class, and like you don't need to know. This is not a morphology class. I'm not expecting you guys to know like the insect leg parts. But I show this figure here because you see that the evolution of these leg parts is again sort of similar to like the evolution of the mouth parts, in that you have these set structures, this set sort of formulation of insect legs. And in this case, here's the D louse. Here's the pubic louse. C is the body louse. What's the difference between the pubic louse and the body louse? Location, but look at how their claws are different, because head hair is different than pubic hair, okay, in terms of diameter. So like, isn't that kind of fascinating? Like, I think that's fascinating, to be honest. That their legs are literally evolved, and that's why you can't get pubic lice on your head and you can't get head lice on your pubic hair. Anyway, it's an interesting evolutionary relationship. These are what salivary glands look like. So we've talked a lot about the salivary glands. In a mosquito, the salivary glands are in, so here's the head, here's the thorax, they're in the thorax. And here's just a picture that shows you how to dissect them. You can actually dissect these out. Here's what they look like when you dissect them out. So oftentimes when people screen for viruses in mosquitoes, is it most relevant to screen the entire insect for the virus, or is it more pertinent to screen the salivary glands? Which one is sort of like a better indicator of transmittability? That's a question. So there, in theory, there could be two ways that you could screen mosquitoes for whether or not they're carrying a particular disease. One, you could grind up an entire mosquito, extract the DNA, and run a PCR reaction to check for the virus. Or you could dissect out salivary glands, extract DNA or RNA, and run a PCR and see if there's a pathogen there. Which one would be, in theory, better? Yeah, the salivary glands, because the salivary glands are going to indicate to you like this disease is actually transmittable. It's not just like in the gut. It's actually transmittable because it's in the salivary glands, it's being spit out. So this is a common thing you'll see when you start reading like mosquito literature or stuff like that. And I show the salivary glands. Here's some salivary glands from Drosophila. I show this because this is really interesting. Salivary glands are famous for having what are called polytene chromosomes. Polytene chromosomes are when the cells become aneuploid on purpose. So aneuploidy means they're duplicating their genome content many, many, many times. And so in the salivary glands are famous for taking their chromosomes and copying them time after time after time after time, so that each cell has multiple copies of each chromosome. Why would they do that? Yes, the salivary gland is essentially like a gland whose function is to mass produce proteins. It's almost like it's like a fake recombinant protein factory. So because they're literally just producing proteins that should be spit into whatever they're spitting. So they need to mass produce proteins. And so the way that they do that is they make multiple copies of their chromosomes. They become aneuploid. That means more messenger RNA. That means they make more protein. So this is just a really interesting factoid about salivary glands, and these were famous in Drosophila because if you look at when people were early studying Drosophila genetics, the karyotypes, which are like the pictures of the chromosomes, those all came from salivary glands where they had polytene chromosomes because it was like a way where they could easily see these things. And here's a good picture of that. So this is you might ask the question, how do we know what's in the salivary gland proteins? How do we know that the salivary glands make proteins, and how do we know what those proteins are for each particular insect? Okay, and you guys are all pretty advanced. So I have this here for like people who wouldn't know what SDS page is, but you guys know what these things are. The essential point is you can take a mosquito and you can dip its proboscis in a drop of oil, okay? And I don't know if you squeeze it or just let it sit there or whatever, but eventually a little drop of saliva can accumulate inside of that droplet of oil, okay? And if you take that saliva droplet and you combine a bunch of them into a tube, you can get enough which you can extract protein from. And you can run these proteins on SDS page analysis, and we can actually like identify what you would call the salivary gland proteome or the saliva proteome or the saliva-ome, something like that. And so there are gels from old papers where people have identified the protein constituents of saliva. And some of the things that you find in these salivas are an enzyme called apyrase, okay? Apyrase is one of the functional inhibitors of platelet aggregation. So this is an enzyme, it's ATP dependent. You don't have to remember the mechanism. I just want you to know that like this is an example of there is an enzyme in mosquito saliva that literally can mechanistically inhibit platelets from aggregating, and that prevents your blood from clotting. So that's actually like literally like been shown. It's an anticoagulant. Mechanism. If you haven't had physiology, you should know that your blood vessels, your veins, your arteries, your capillaries, they're all surrounded by muscles, okay? And the muscles can squeeze, and if the muscles squeeze, the diameter of the tube gets smaller, and this is called vasoconstriction. So when you hear about like high blood pressure and stuff, oftentimes what's happening is maybe the tubes are squeezing and it's increasing the pressure. The opposite can happen where those muscles can relax, and that's called vasodilation, and it makes the tube wider. Now, which of these do you think is going to have a higher, well, I don't know about higher speed, but a bigger flow rate? Yeah, vasodilation is going to have more stuff flowing through. You might be able to like speed up the speed of the blood. I don't recall from my physiology classes. Like the volume of contents might be moving faster in here, but this is going to be moving more volume. And so usually what happens is these insects, which do you think they want to feed from? Yeah, so many of these insects have evolved specific salivary proteins which induce vasodilation, and that's going to increase the amount of volume of blood that they encounter. So there's this protein called D7. Again, like it's not important to me that you remember these names, but it is important to me that you remember the concept that insects have many, many proteins in their saliva. Some of these are anticoagulants, some of these are vasodilators. One of these is D7, it's an example of this. Again, how do we know this? So this is a really cool science paper, and it's literally like 2 pages. I put it in the readings, I believe. It's well worth reading because it's just an awesome paper, and the figures are really cool. And what they did is, this is, again, it's like in I don't know if this is like 1945 or 1960, the science paper in 1960. They took a mosquito and they did surgery on the mosquito, and they cut the tube that delivers the saliva. So up top, it would come out the hypopharynx. I don't know what the tube's called, maybe the salivary duct, but the salivary duct might be like Might be like here. But anyway, what I'm essentially telling you is they cut the tube that delivers the saliva. And then they have a plus saliva control. So they have a plus saliva mosquito, and they have a minus saliva mosquito, which has underwent surgery. And they feed these mosquitoes on humans. And what do you think is the interesting result that they found when they compared these two? No, the salivary glands are not essential for feeding. Both these mosquitoes can still feed. So you don't need salivary. It's not like the maxillary palps. You don't need the saliva.
The one without the saliva did not give an infection.
Not an infection, but I think you're on the right track. I think you're saying the wrong word.
Did it come off the pipe?
No, it didn't come off the pipe. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so I'll just explain it. The one without saliva gave no, you know how mosquito bites like itch and you get like the red mark. I forget there's a name for that. I forget what it's called. But in the one without saliva, there's no reaction for the human. And the one with saliva, there's an allergic reaction which creates the itch. So what you conclude from this is the reason that you get itchy when a mosquito bites you is because of the proteins that it's injecting into you when it feeds. Those create an allergic reaction with antibodies, and that's why you get itchy. Okay, so if the other thing that they comment on in this paper is they claim that there was an anesthetic component. So anesthesia would be like you don't feel pain. In the one where they clip the tube, those would be more painful, is what they claimed, more painful. And so the thought is there's also might be salivary glands that inhibit your neurons, that inhibit like your ability to like feel. And right, why would the mosquito not want that? Is because it doesn't want you to go and like feel it. So there's a thought that there are anesthetics also in the saliva. So there's many different things I've listed in the saliva, anticoagulants, vasodilators, and anesthetics. So actually a really interesting common theme is for people looking for like blood pressure drugs, what they do is they go to insect salivary glands or like snake venom glands, things like that, and they extract the proteins and they look for proteins that can help with, that are vasodilators that could be used in theory as like therapeutics for people with blood pressure. So that's actually like a common theme in science. I really want to get to this other stuff. Do you guys have places to be? Like if I just go for like, if I go an extra 5 minutes, does it bother you? It bothers Lauren. I'll try to go as quickly as I can. I just want to get this in because it doesn't make sense in any other lecture and it's really, really cool. And I'm still not over yet. I still have 2 minutes. So maybe I'll get it done in time if I go quick. A common theme that you find in blood feeding insects is blood is a very nutrient, low nutrient content food. So there's not actually a lot of nutrients in blood. I mean, there's enough, there's proteins and stuff, but it's not a high nutrient content in terms of its volume. So what happens is these blood feeders, they have to take in a gigantic volume and then they have to filter out the water to condense the nutrients. That's a very, very common theme. So you see what's called engorgement. Here, here's a tick, and the tick can supposedly increase its size by 100-fold. So they're literally like balloons. Here's a mosquito. They fill up, and then what they do is they go through this process called diuresis, which is essentially they have little kidneys. So they're called Malpighian tubules. Just like we have kidneys, the function of the kidneys is to filter out the water and condense the nutrients and excrete the waste. So the mosquitoes will take or any insect will take a giant blood meal, they'll expand, go through the process of engorgement, and then they will filter out the water, poop out the water, and condense the contents, and then they'll usually, the reason they're feeding on you is to collect protein for eggs. So then they'll synthesize eggs. Now you might ask the question, how do they do this? This is actually like a really cool evolution. Like how is it possible that a tiny tick, it's a hard structure, can fill up 100-fold of its volume like a balloon? So they have specialized cuticle. Insects have specialized cuticle that can expand. It's not always actually hard. This is a bad example because it's a spider, but structurally, here's what you're seeing is these are pleats in the cuticle. And so it's kind of like kind of like this, and they can be pulled such that they elongate like this. Here's what you're seeing here, the elongation, and here you're seeing the condensed version. There's other structures. Here's tsetse fly. Tsetse flies are medically relevant pests. Here they have, again, same thing, kind of like pleated ridges, but in this case, they're kind of like this. And when it stretches these out so that it can engorge. Here is, what is this, grasshopper? So I have these, I guess these are not the worst, these are not the best examples, but these are great pictures, which is why I show them. The grasshopper, here's a cuticle where it's stretched out. And in this case, it's kind of like a spring, and then it can kind of like stretch out. So there's special evolutions in the cuticle that permit this to happen, engorgement. Because the mosquito, how likely is it that the mosquito can have an unlimited buffet on blood? It's very unlikely. It's very hard for a mosquito to get a blood meal. So when it finds a spot, when it finds a source, it needs to get everything it needs, and it needs to fill up to get everything it needs. So that's what they do. Almost done here, only 1 minute over. That was the coolest thing I wanted to show you. Once they engorge, the midgut stretches, and when the midgut stretches, in most insects, it causes a signaling cascade. You don't need to know it, but it causes a signaling cascade, which causes them to synthesize eggs, which is a process of vitellogenesis, which you should know because I talked about it. So that's it. Have a good day.
So when they eat, they actually want to make the